When Daniel Moore moved into his dream home, he never imagined a battle would erupt over his own porch. Karen Wilson, the power-hungry HOA president, weaponized her authority to harass and humiliate him, even going so far as to tear down part of his property without warning. But when Daniel uncovered a shocking truth about her violations, the tables turned in the most unexpected way. Just wait until you hear how this fight for justice ended and why Karen's reign of terror came crashing down. When Daniel Moore finally bought his first home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he imagined nothing less than a peaceful, idyllic life. The picturesque streets, lined with neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences, felt like the perfect place to start fresh. He'd saved for years to make this dream a reality, and now it was his. A cozy house with a charming front porch that seemed to welcome him every time he came home. Little did he know, that porch would soon become the center of his worst nightmare. It all began just a few weeks after moving in. One sunny morning, as Daniel was enjoying his coffee and the soft chirping of birds, a sudden and forceful knock at the door shattered the calm. Startled, he set down his mug and opened the door, only to find himself face to face with a woman who radiated authority and irritation. "Karen Wilson," she announced briskly, clutching a clipboard and a thick stack of papers. "I'm the head of the HOA." Daniel blinked, unsure of what to make of her. Karen's sharp eyes scanned him like a laser, as though she were searching for something to criticize. Without waiting for an invitation, she launched into her complaint. "This porch," she began, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured dramatically at the wooden structure. "It's an eyesore, it's old, ugly, and completely against HOA guidelines. You need to remove it immediately." Daniel was taken aback. The porch? His porch? He glanced over at the structure she was attacking with her words. Sure, it wasn't brand new, but it had been well maintained and added to the charm of the house. "I'm sorry, but the porch was here when I bought the house," he explained carefully, trying to keep the conversation civil. "I don't see what's wrong with it." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. "What's wrong," she snapped, "is that it violates HOA standards. I've already sent you the regulations. You're required to comply, or I'll have no choice but to escalate this matter." Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was his property, his home. The porch wasn't hurting anyone, yet Karen seemed determined to make it her mission to get rid of it. He tried to reason with her, pointing out that it was structurally sound and inoffensive, but she refused to budge. Her threats escalated in the days that followed. Letters started arriving in Daniel's mailbox, formal notices demanding the removal of the porch, complete with warnings of hefty fines if he didn't comply. Karen even began plastering notices on his door for the whole neighborhood to see, as though publicly shaming him was part of her strategy. One morning, Daniel woke up to find an inspector walking around his property with Karen close behind, pointing and gesturing at the porch. The inspector looked vaguely apologetic, but informed Daniel that complaints had been filed and an inspection was mandatory. Karen's relentless campaign began to take a toll on Daniel. Every time he came home, he braced himself for another letter, another notice, another confrontation. What had once been his safe haven now felt like enemy territory. He started avoiding sitting on the porch altogether, fearing another sharp knock on the door, or worse, a surprise visit from Karen herself. The stress was unbearable. Karen's persistence made him feel small and powerless, like he didn't belong in the very community he had worked so hard to join. Daniel began to wonder if buying this house had been a mistake, but deep down, something in him refused to give in. This was his home, his porch, and as much as Karen Wilson seemed to believe otherwise, she didn't own him. The situation spiraled out of control faster than Daniel could have imagined. The letters from the HOA came like clockwork, each one more intimidating than the last. They weren't simple reminders, they were demands, laced with threats of action if he didn't comply. The fines listed in those letters were staggering. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars, piling up like a debt he hadn't even agreed to. And as if that weren't enough, Karen's ominous promise of a lawsuit began to loom over him like a storm cloud. The stress was relentless. Daniel, a man who had always believed in resolving things peacefully, decided it was time to seek support from his neighbors. Maybe, just maybe, someone could provide insight or guidance. Knocking on doors and striking up conversations, he quickly realized just how deep Karen's influence ran. The neighbors weren't unkind, but their fear was palpable. "You're not the first one she's gone after," admitted Sarah, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Her voice was hushed, and she glanced over her shoulder as if Karen might be listening. "She's got this power. People are too scared to fight her. She bullied my husband about our garden once. After that, we just gave up. It wasn't worth the fight." Daniel's heart sank. The more neighbors he spoke to, the more stories he heard of Karen's authoritarian reign. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was weaponizing them. For years, she had used her position as HOA president to impose her will on the community, and few had the courage to stand up to her. Still, Daniel held on to a sliver of hope that things couldn't get worse. But that hope was shattered one crisp morning when he was jolted awake by the sound of heavy machinery. Groggy and confused, he pulled back his curtain to see a sight that made his stomach drop: a team of construction workers tearing apart his porch. His heart raced as he scrambled to throw on shoes and rush outside. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. The workers barely glanced at him before returning to their task, tools buzzing and wood splintering under their assault. Standing to the side, clipboard in hand, and a smug expression on her face, was Karen. "This is for the good of the community," she announced, as if she were doing him a favor. "The porch was a violation, and since you refused to act, we had no choice but to handle it ourselves." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. No warning, no consent. She had taken it upon herself to invade his property and destroy something that wasn't hers to touch. The sight of his once proud porch reduced to rubble felt like a punch to the gut. He stood there, helpless, as the workers carried on under Karen's supervision. For the first time since this ordeal began, Daniel felt utterly powerless. It wasn't just the physical destruction of his property. It was the deeper realization that Karen believed she could do whatever she wanted, and the system seemed to back her up. The humiliation, the violation of his space, the sense of being cornered, it all became too much to bear. As the last plank of wood was hauled away, Daniel stood in the debris of his own dreams. He had never felt more defeated. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of frustration and despair, a spark of determination began to flicker. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniel refused to let the rubble of his porch become the end of his fight. The anger and helplessness he had felt watching Karen's hired workers dismantle his property transformed into something stronger: resolve. He realized that if he didn't stand up to her now, she would keep trampling over anyone who dared to oppose her. This wasn't just about a porch anymore, it was about principle. The first step was finding a lawyer. Daniel scoured local recommendations and finally connected with a property attorney named Michael Kane, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who had dealt with his fair share of HOA disputes. Michael listened intently as Daniel recounted everything: the letters, the fines, the public shaming, and finally, the destruction of his porch. "She had no right to do that," Michael said firmly, scribbling notes. "But we need solid evidence if we're going to fight this." Taking Michael's advice, Daniel hired a surveyor to map the boundaries of his property. The results, when they came in, were nothing short of jaw-dropping. Not only was Daniel's porch entirely within his legal property lines, but the survey revealed something even more damning. Karen's porch, the one she had so proudly maintained and defended, extended well beyond her property and encroached significantly onto Daniel's land. Daniel could hardly believe it. All this time, Karen had been harassing him over supposed violations, while she herself had blatantly overstepped her bounds. The irony was almost too perfect. Armed with this evidence, Michael helped Daniel file a lawsuit against both the HOA and Karen personally. The legal documents laid out a clear case. Karen's actions were not only unjustified, but also a blatant abuse of power. She had overstepped her authority, both figuratively and literally. Word of Daniel's lawsuit spread quickly through the neighborhood. At first, there was a mix of disbelief and curiosity. Few people had ever dared to stand up to Karen, and even fewer had done so publicly. But as the details of the case became known, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors started reaching out to Daniel, some to offer words of encouragement, others to share their own stories of Karen's overreach. "She fined us for planting flowers that weren't approved," one neighbor confessed. "We ended up paying just to avoid the hassle." "She made us repaint our entire house because she didn't like the shade of blue," said another. "It wasn't even in the rules." The stories poured in, each one painting a clearer picture of Karen's reign of intimidation. The neighborhood, once cowed by her authoritarian tactics, began to see her for what she truly was, a bully who thrived on fear and control. Daniel's stand inspired them. Slowly but surely, people started speaking out. A community meeting was called, where residents openly discussed their grievances for the first time. Karen, who had always commanded these meetings with an air of superiority, found herself outnumbered and outmatched. For the first time in years, her authority was being questioned. As the court date approached, Karen's grip on the neighborhood began to loosen. The very people she had once intimidated were now rallying behind Daniel, their support giving him the strength to keep going. Karen, once so confident and untouchable, was losing her influence. For Daniel, the fight was far from over, but he no longer felt alone. The neighborhood was waking up, and Karen's days of unchecked power were coming to an end. What had started as a battle over a porch was transforming into a fight for justice, and this time, Daniel was ready to win. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the hearing began. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his attorney Michael, who exuded confidence. Across the room sat Karen Wilson, her demeanor far less assured than usual. For the first time, she didn't appear as the commanding, unshakable presence the neighborhood had come to fear. Her usual air of superiority was replaced with visible unease. The evidence Michael presented was meticulous and damning. He started with the survey results, displaying clear diagrams that outlined the property boundaries. The oversized, unauthorized section of Karen's porch glaringly extended onto Daniel's land. Then came the HOA's own bylaws, which Michael cited to prove Karen's actions had not only been an abuse of power, but also a violation of the very rules she claimed to enforce. Karen attempted to defend herself, offering a flurry of excuses. She claimed it was an honest mistake, that she had always acted in the best interest of the community, and that Daniel's porch was a safety hazard to the neighborhood. But her words rang hollow. The courtroom could see through the veneer of justification. Michael systematically dismantled her arguments, pointing out the contradictions in her claims and exposing the selective enforcement of rules that had benefited Karen while punishing others. The turning point came when Daniel took the stand. Calm and composed, he shared his side of the story: the months of harassment, the fines, the destruction of his porch, and the humiliation he endured. His testimony was raw and heartfelt, resonating with everyone in the room. He didn't speak with anger, but with conviction, and the weight of his words left a powerful impression. As Karen listened, her face grew increasingly strained. For years, she had wielded her authority without challenge, but now, under the scrutiny of the court, her actions were laid bare for what they truly were: abuses of power. When the judge delivered the verdict, the room fell silent. The decision was swift and unequivocal. Karen was found guilty of trespassing and overreach. The HOA was ordered to cover all of Daniel's legal fees and compensate him for the damages, including the cost of rebuilding his porch. But that wasn't all. The judge issued a direct order requiring Karen to remove the section of her own porch that encroached on Daniel's property. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Karen's face was a mixture of disbelief and humiliation as the reality of the ruling set in. For the first time, she was on the receiving end of consequences, and the power she had so ruthlessly exercised was stripped away in an instant. For Daniel, it was a moment of triumph. He had stood his ground against someone who had tried to intimidate him into submission, and he had won. But it wasn't just about his victory. It was about what it represented. Daniel's courage and persistence had set a precedent, showing the neighborhood that no one, not even Karen Wilson, was above accountability. After the trial, the ripple effects of the case spread quickly. Karen was forced to resign as HOA president, a move celebrated by the community. Her departure marked the end of an era of fear and control. In her place, the neighborhood began electing new leadership, people who were committed to fairness and collaboration rather than intimidation. The atmosphere in the neighborhood started to shift. Neighbors who had once felt isolated began to connect with one another, sharing stories of their own experiences and finding solidarity in their shared struggles. Community meetings became places of open dialogue instead of venues for Karen's ultimatums. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to heal. Daniel's story became a symbol of resilience. His stand against injustice inspired others to find their own voices, and the lesson was clear. No matter how daunting the fight might seem, standing up for what's right is always worth it. Through pain, anger, and struggle, Daniel had not only reclaimed his porch, but had also helped his community reclaim its sense of harmony and hope.